Welcome to this week's lecture about fundamentalism. So, when we're talking about fundamentalism, we are focusing on religious fundamentalism, where really the core idea of many is that there's no distinction between religion and politics. Religion is not something that should be restricted to the private realm. It should be in the public realm. It should be something that is part of politics and govern politics, because without it, you might have a morally debased society, right? And there's religious fundamentalism in all of the major religious faiths around the world: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, and Sikhism. And we really have seen the increase of religious fundamentalism occurring in the late 20th century. So, for example, when it comes to religious fundamentalism and Islam, the 1979 Iranian Revolution really spearheaded the introduction of religious fundamentalism within the religion of Islam. The Islamic Revolution, the revolution started, and it was a really widespread movement across all elements of Iranian society, in part because of the US's influence in Iranian politics. There was a democratically elected leader that the US helped overthrow, instituted a monarch, but it wasn't solely because of the United States. Iranians wanted to have a democratic government, so there really was a very widespread movement, and it just so happened, for a variety of reasons, that among the different groups within this big mass movement, the religious one took precedence. And so you ended up getting an Islamic revolution in Iran that paved the way for Islamic movements across other countries, in part because of the Soviet Union invasion of Afghanistan. In the late 1980s, you had this movement of religious believers who wanted to fight against the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan. And then this evolved into the emergence of Al-Qaeda, which initially was just an organization that was focused on kind of the near enemy, which would be any kind of leaders in the Middle East and North Africa who were not seen as religious enough. So it wasn't always the case that Al-Qaeda was trying to fight against the United States. Initially, a lot of their attacks were focused just on kind of domestic politics, but that movement did have a global aspect to it, as a lot of religious fundamentalist movements do. And so this is a figure, and the links to this are in the slides, the slide notes of movements or organizations that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda across the Middle East and North Africa and Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. This, and you can click on this, is a data visualization that will allow you to see the presence of ISIS around the world today. Now, ISIS used to have territory, it used to control territory in Iraq. It controlled Mosul, which is Iraq's second biggest city. But because of US coalition efforts, and a bombing campaign, that territory was regained by the Iraqi government. But you still have a number of organizations that have pledged allegiance to ISIS worldwide. And then also, when we're talking about religious fundamentalism from an Islamist perspective, we can talk about the Taliban. The Taliban is another example of a Sunni organization. So these are all Sunni organizations, Sunni being the majority religion practiced by Muslims around the world. Shiites make up a minority of Muslims, but they are a majority in Persia, or in Iran rather. as well as in Iraq and some other countries. So these are all Sunni organizations, and the Taliban is different than Al Qaeda and ISIS. So this makes an interesting contrast because unlike Al Qaeda and ISIS, who really have transnational goals, they really want to focus on this like global establishment of an Islamic state. The Taliban never wanted to expand past the borders of Afghanistan. They're more of a religious nationalist movement where they just wanted to gain control of the Afghan government. They wanted to kick out all of the foreign who they deemed occupiers like the United States. And so even though the Taliban in Afghanistan, Al Qaeda, and ISIS are all Islamist organizations and that have used violence, their goals are still different. We also have seen religious fundamentalism emerge in the United States. Christian fundamentalism when it comes to the moral majority in the US, this movement by Jerry Falwell. You can go to this New York Times article that's linked here that talks about him and his role in this moral majority. Sikhism is another religion, and there were a number of organizations that basically wanted to establish their own state for this religious community. In the early 1980s, a leader of one of these organizations took over a Hindu temple that led to a big response from the Indian government. And so this is another example of how religious fundamentalism, which we probably tend to associate with Islam because of 9/11, is not unique to the Islamic faith. It's present in all of the major religions across the world, including Hinduism. So your book had talked about the rise of the BJP, as well as some other kind of religious nationalist organizations that it is affiliated with, and how, in fact, actually India, which once was considered the most populous democracy, like the biggest democracy in terms of population in the world, has actually been downgraded by some data collection projects, really prominent ones, VDEM, that measure regime type, because of the rise of the BJP and because of the fact that they have restricted the ability of people to become Indian citizens if you are not born in India, if you happen to be Muslim. So that has downgraded, as well as a couple of other things, has downgraded India into being an electoral autocracy. And now this is a surprising one, perhaps, because maybe we usually associate Buddhism with monks and with peace and with meditation and with calmness, but there is also a Buddhist nationalist movement both in Sri Lanka and in Myanmar, also known as Burma. There's links here to 2 articles. If you're interested, you could check these out. So in Sri Lanka, as I probably have talked about in this class, Sri Lanka had a civil war between the Tamils that are of various religions, but they speak Tamil, and the Sinhalese, who are Buddhist and also speak Sinhala. And so within that Sinhalese Buddhist community, you did have some monks. Again, we would usually think of them as being peaceful, that were very much promoting like an ethno-nationalist view of what Sri Lanka should look like, very exclusionary to the Tamils. And on top of that, they very much advocated for violence. So in the 20-teens, there were a number of riots, not against the Tamil community, because the Tamils have pretty much been subdued since the end of the Civil War in 2009, but against the Muslim community. And that has also been the case in Myanmar. All right, so core themes of fundamentalism. The first one is that there really should not be any separation between religion and politics. I had started this lecture talking about this, right? That this secularization that happened as a result of liberalism, where you had a distinction between like religion being something that you did at home that kind of governed your home life, but it was not, there was no role for it in like the public realm and politics. that religious fundamentalists believe that that is wrong, that not bringing religion into politics has led to a lot of corruption, and it's led to a lot of like morally corrupt things happening, especially a little bit politically, but definitely we're talking about moral corruption. And so that you need to have religion in the public realm, in government, so that all of society can be morally correct, right? And so there's kind of two versions of this. There's the passive fundamentalism, which basically means that these are groups who still believe that there's a place for religion, not just in like their private lives, that it should govern their public lives, but the space in which their public lives exist is shrunken, right? So they're kind of withdrawing from society, like we see the Amish doing in the US, and there is also a big Amish community in Wisconsin too. And there is also an ultra-Orthodox sect in Israel that has also withdrawn from public life and really tries to kind of engage in this passive fundamentalism. And then you have the opposite, you have active fundamentalism, where groups are really trying to challenge the restrictions on there being no religion in politics, and they want to change society. Another core theme is that there are some essential truths that basically religion, and especially the religious texts, and so we see this both in Protestants and in Muslims, because you have sort of like one text that you are using, and you can have a personal relationship with your God, that you should follow this text. It should really guide how your life operates, hence live by the book. And that because this is so important, we're going to try to organize politically to mobilize people so that more people are able to live by the book and by these essential truths. The next core theme of fundamentalism is a mixture of selectively focusing on tradition and selectively focusing on modernism. So it's broadly under the title of anti-modernism, but it's not anti-modern in the sense that religious fundamentalists want to withdraw from society. They actually want to change it in a way that is different from the modern interpretation of the role of religion in society. So they are selectively traditional in the sense that they're morally conservative, but not conservative in the ideology that we learned about, right? So they're strident and passionate, not modest and cautious. These are characteristics that we would associate with conservatism. So hierarchy and elites, conservatism, but that's not what fundamentalism is. Fundamentalism is populist and egalitarian, and really it emerged also in the late 20th century because you had people who felt disenfranchised by society. They felt left behind. Maybe there were some economic crises, and so sometimes people in those moments turn to religion because it really gives you a clear picture of how you should lead your life, right? So it's more populist and egalitarian. It's more about changing society as opposed to continuing the status quo, which is what we associate with conservatism. And it's not traditional in the sense that we're reverting back to previous times and maintaining them. It really is calling for a new way of instituting the role of religion in politics and social change. And then it's also selectively modern because a lot of these religious fundamentalist organizations use modern technology and engage in sort of like capitalism and market economies like the Iranian government does, right? You all may or may not have seen this, but ISIS in particular was well known for its relatively robust social media campaign. So they had like an ISIS TV, they were on social media for recruitment, for publicizing their tactics. So, that's pretty modern. And so we can say that, yes, religious fundamentalists are anti-modern in the sense that they do not want the separation of religion and politics, but the tactics that they use are still pretty modern. All right, and our last theme of religious fundamentalism is militancy. So this is really the idea that you are a strident supporter and you're pretty much willing to do anything for your cause, right? So the stakes in this worldview, in this ideology, are really high, and they're high because you have a mission from God to execute, right? So that's important if you're a fundamentalist. Religion is part of your identity. So when we talked about multiculturalism and we talked about identity politics, and when we talked about, say, ethnicity, right, religion can be a really, really important part of people's identities. So it leads to this in-group, out-group phenomenon. And then also it leads to this view that you're in this epic battle between the forces of good and light and the forces of darkness and evil. So it just means that the stakes are really high. And when the stakes are really high, people may try to justify the use of violence, right? And to do things outside of the bounds of normal politics. Now, this is not to say that all groups do this. Again, we usually associate suicide terrorism with Islamism, and it's true that Hezbollah, which is a Shiite organization that operates in Lebanon, was the first group in modern times, say post-World War II, to use suicide terrorists, but also the Tamil Tigers, who are not a Islamist group, but they're an ethno-nationalist group in Sri Lanka. They used a lot of suicide terrorist attacks. In fact, they had a special unit called the Black Tigers. Chechens, when they were fighting for their own state, also had a special suicide terrorist bombing unit called the Black Widows. So these were women who were suicide bombers. And so, yes, it's true that we obviously have a violent element with religious fundamentalist groups, not restricted exclusively to those who are Islamist, but there are also many organizations in all of these different fundamentalist movements who don't advocate for the use of violence and are trying to use regular politics to do so, right? So just to keep that in mind. And if you're interested in learning a little bit about terrorism, you can go to this Our World in Data page about terrorism, where they have a few different infographics and data visualizations that you can check out.